picking them apart and changing the point of view. It's something that I do for fun a lot and never really show on here, but I also do.
Delivering lines, it is a privilege, an honor, and for me it has become a lifeline. I cherish it so much because it is not only about the art of storytelling, but also about the people I meet along the way, the audiences, the fans, the friends, and the supporters who to do what we do. And to make movies is not simply a matter of showing up on set or make every exhausting day worth it. I love this journey more than words can capture, because every time I step into this world, I get to see you, to feel the energy of those who believe in me, and to be reminded that the work matters to someone beyond myself. I am endlessly grateful for the countless individuals who have walked beside me through different seasons of my career, whether you have been with us for 3 summers straight, whether you discovered me 2 summers ago, or even if you've just come back now for this one. The length of time doesn't matter, because what matters is the connection, and that connection has grown into a family for me. This family is not bound by blood, but by shared experiences, by the laughter and the tears, by the resilience we've shown together, and by the simple fact that you stayed. And for that, I am more thankful than you can imagine, because this has been such a complicated and difficult journey, filled with obstacles and missteps, yet also with moments of joy and triumph so bright that they carried me through the darkest stretches. One memory that always comes to mind when I think about the challenges is a terrible audition that still lingers in my head as if it happened yesterday. I was auditioning for a Broadway revival of one of the most beloved and recognizable musicals in theater history, a production that carried the weight of decades of legacy. I had prepared endlessly, poured myself into the music, and walked in with hope that this was my chance to prove myself. And yet, as I sang, as I gave every ounce of breath and feeling I had to the room, the producers and directors sat there distracted, casually ordering lunch in the middle of my performance. Imagine standing in a room where your dream is on the line, and instead of being seen, instead of being heard, you are treated as background noise to someone's sandwich order. The humiliation was crushing, a reminder of just how indifferent and brutal this business can be, how quickly human effort can be dismissed. I left that room shaken, convinced I had failed, convinced perhaps that I wasn't enough. And yet, in one of those strange twists of fate, only a week later I was cast in West Side Story, a role that would completely alter the course of my career and life. That moment taught me a lesson I have never forgotten. This industry is both devastating and miraculous, full of contradictions, and the very same rejection that makes you feel invisible can be followed by an opportunity that changes everything. It is hard, undeniably hard, and at times it is unbearably lonely. Loneliness sits heavy in this profession, even when surrounded by lights and cameras, even when you are applauded on stage or photographed on the red carpet. But I remind myself constantly that if loneliness can exist so powerfully, then so too can joy, connection, and resilience, and that balance is what carries me forward. I hold on to reminders, symbols, and metaphors that strengthen me, like the story of the winged victory of Samothrace, the magnificent statue that arrived at the Louvre broken into pieces, cracked and incomplete, yet still regarded as one of the greatest treasures of art history. People line up every day just to stand in her presence, to admire her beauty, to see something timeless even in her broken form. That lesson guides me. I know I have flaws, I know I have cracks and breaks, many of them, but I hope that despite all of that, or maybe even because of it, people will still want to see me, to experience my work, to stand with me as I continue to build, learn, and create. But even as I try to focus on that hope, the Hollywood rumor mill refuses to slow down. It spins endlessly, feeding on whispers, shaping narratives out of shadows, and this time I find myself, Rachel Zegler, right at the center of its merciless turning. What began as quiet murmurs, half-suspicions and anonymous chatter on the fringes of the industry has escalated into loud and relentless conversation. Headlines, speculation, and endless commentary dominate the conversation, painting pictures that are not always fair but impossible to ignore. And now, at what may be the most fragile and chaotic moment of my career, the news has broken that my publicist has walked away. This wasn't a quiet departure, not a behind-the-scenes adjustment, but a loud signal to the industry and to the world, one that has drawn immediate scrutiny. The timing could not be worse, and the move has sent shockwaves through Hollywood, leaving executives, fans, and critics alike wondering what is really going on. If we rewind to just a few weeks ago, the story unfolded slowly, almost deceptively. It began with silence, a silence that at first felt calculated, as though it were part of some bigger plan, a strategy to pull back before a major announcement or reinvention. But as the days passed, silence turned into cancellations, one after another, commitments falling apart, appearances postponed or abandoned. What once could be explained as rest or strategy began to look like collapse, like a storm gathering force. And now, layered on top of the silence and the cancellations, comes the publicist's exit, a move that can no longer be brushed off as coincidence. It is a spark added to the fire, and that fire is burning brighter and hotter than ever, feeding the rumor mill, drawing the attention of the entire industry, and leaving everyone on edge, waiting to see how the story will play out. Whether this is the start of a downfall or simply another chapter in a long and complicated journey of resilience, survival, and reinvention according to sources close to the situation, the sudden and very public exit of Rachel Zegler's publicist was the final breaking point in a publicity strategy that had already been fraying for weeks, a strategy that industry insiders now describe as having fallen apart at the seams long before the outside world began to notice. In Hollywood, such things are rare. Publicists do not simply abandon clients in moments of crisis. If anything, they are the last line of defense, the professionals called upon to contain fires when a career is threatened and the headlines are spinning out of control. They are the invisible architects of narrative, the ones who can make a star look untouchable one week and sympathetic the next, who know which doors to knock on, which journalists to court, and which stories to bury before they spread. For one to walk away at the height of a scandal, particularly from a young actress still considered a rising star with multiple projects in various stages of development, is almost unheard of, and for that reason alone, the decision has rattled industry veterans. But those closest to the situation insist that the chaos surrounding Zegler had become impossible to manage, with no roadmap, no clear narrative, and no strategy left to salvage. Nobody wanted to be the public face of what had become a PR disaster, one insider admitted, explaining that while Hollywood thrives on reinvention, it also recoils from situations that seem to spiral without control. To be attached to Zegler at this moment, they suggested, was to risk professional credibility, and no one wanted to gamble their reputation on a client whose trajectory had veered so wildly off course. What makes the unraveling even more fascinating is the way it did not arrive suddenly, but crept in slowly, almost invisibly, long before the public caught on. At first, the silence looked deliberate, even strategic, a pause designed to serve as a career reset, the kind of calculated absence that stars occasionally use to shift their image, retreat from overexposure, or prepare for a bold comeback. But as weeks stretched on, that silence transformed into something darker. Behind closed doors, insiders describe mounting panic and a sense of disorganization that began to alarm even her stanchest supporters. Studios, once eager to showcase her, began pulling back invitations to events. High-profile collaborators, wary of being caught in the blast radius, began creating distance. Opportunities evaporated quietly, and the actress who had once been courted as part of Hollywood's next generation of bankable talent found herself increasingly sidelined. By the time her publicist's departure made headlines, the damage was already extensive, and the industry had begun to murmur that the situation might be unsalvageable. The absence of a guiding hand only compounded the problem. A vacuum of communication in Hollywood is rarely neutral. It breeds speculation, fuels rumor, and allows narratives to be written by anyone but the star herself. Each cancelled interview, every missed press appearance, and every opportunity that passed without clarification only widened the gap between perception and reality. In that void, gossip metastasized, and what could have been dismissed as temporary turbulence hardened into the perception of a full-blown collapse. People began asking questions, not only about her choices but about her stability, her professionalism, even her future, and in the absence of any official answers, the industry began supplying its own. For a performer who had been carefully positioned as a face of Hollywood's bright, youthful energy, the silence did not protect, it suffocated. Perhaps the most revealing detail, according to insiders, was the deliberate nature of the quiet once the Evita incident erupted into public scandal. Under normal circumstances, the playbook would have been activated with precision, a statement released within hours, either apologizing or clarifying, a controlled interview in which she could show contrition, humanity, or strength. and carefully managed social media posts designed to recast her in a sympathetic light. Hollywood is built on these mechanisms of damage control, and history has shown that even the gravest reputational wounds can be managed if the messaging is steady, swift, and authentic enough to resonate. Instead, Zegler's team appeared to take the opposite path. According to multiple accounts, they implemented what one insider called a comprehensive media blackout, withdrawing her completely from view, cutting off communication with fans, ignoring inquiries from the press, and refusing even the most standard of responses. In theory, it was a strategy of containment: no words, no missteps, no statements, no fuel for controversy. But in practice, it created the impression that there was something to hide, that the rumors had truth to them, and that her camp either had no defense or, worse, did not care to provide one. The result was devastating. Without a spokesperson to act as a shield, Zegler was left exposed to the full force of an increasingly skeptical industry and a restless public. Every headline cut deeper because there was no counterpoint, no narrative offered in her defense. Every rumor snowballed because it was allowed to go unanswered. And in Hollywood, where silence often reads as guilt, the blackout strategy became indistinguishable from surrender. For a performer once considered one of the faces of a new Hollywood era, diverse, dynamic, and future-focused, the mismanagement has turned into not just a setback, but potentially a defining crisis. One that could dictate whether she is remembered as a fleeting star undone by scandal or as an actress resilient enough to survive one of the most punishing PR collapses in recent memory. According to sources familiar with what insiders have dubbed the blackout strategy, the silence surrounding Rachel Zegler was never accidental, nor was it the result of poor organization or oversight. It was, at least on paper, a carefully designed tactic meant to minimize damage, one crafted in hushed meetings where her team debated how to navigate a rapidly escalating scandal. The plan, reportedly, was rooted in the logic that sometimes doing nothing is safer than doing anything at all. By withdrawing her from the spotlight, restricting appearances, and denying the press even the smallest soundbite, the thinking was that the furor would eventually burn itself out. In a culture oversaturated with outrage and hungry for the next story, why feed the fire when silence might let it starve? The team hoped scandal fatigue would set in, that after a few weeks of quiet, public attention would wander elsewhere, leaving her free to re-emerge once the dust had settled. There was precedent for this approach. Other celebrities had gone dark in the face of controversy and returned with minimal scars, but in Zegler's case, the gamble misfired catastrophically. Rather than dying down, the controversy grew louder and more suffocating. The absence of explanation created a vacuum, and in Hollywood, vacuums never remain empty for long. The internet filled the silence with rumor, conjecture, and increasingly hostile speculation, each thread of gossip twisting into a narrative that painted her in the worst possible light. What might have been perceived as enigmatic restraint began to look like avoidance, even arrogance. Her silence, once possibly interpretable as strength, transformed into something that looked harmful, even self-destructive, as audiences and industry insiders alike wondered why she refused to take control of her own story. Behind the scenes, those close to her admit that the decision was not unanimous. In fact, it was a point of fierce contention. Some advisors argued that an aggressive strategy was the only viable option: a sit-down with a trusted journalist, an empathetic press release, carefully crafted social media posts to humanize her and reassure the public. They believed only visibility could save her, that the longer she stayed hidden, the more she would appear guilty, fragile, or indifferent. Others, however, cautioned that every appearance would hand her critics fresh ammunition. They warned that a single misphrased word, a facial expression taken out of context, or even the wrong tone of voice could spiral into another headline. The debates grew heated, but indecision won the day. Instead of bold action or clear communication, the result was paralysis. Inactivity became the default, hesitation the standard operating procedure. Industry observers quickly noticed the odd silences, the events she skipped without explanation, the social media accounts that fell dormant. Reporters who had once been granted access were suddenly stonewalled. Executives whispered privately about her absence from projects she was still officially attached to. Even her co-stars, usually quick to offer polite words of praise for a colleague, seemed to avoid mentioning her at all. What was meant to be calming instead alarmed everyone who was watching. To those inside Hollywood's echo chamber, the silence was no longer strategic, it was ominous. The most revealing signal, however, was not a loud public meltdown or a viral scandal, but something far subtler. It happened at an exclusive press junket for a highly anticipated streaming project, an event designed to showcase the cast and generate positive buzz before release. Zegler had been confirmed to appear, her time slots booked, her talking points rehearsed and polished. Journalists had prepared their questions, expecting to see her seated alongside her castmates, ready to offer the kinds of bite-sized quotes that fuel press coverage. Yet when the cameras rolled, she was nowhere to be found. There was no official explanation, no sudden illness cited, no scheduling emergency offered as a shield. Instead, reporters were quietly told to skip her segment altogether, as though she had never been scheduled in the first place. For those in attendance, the omission was jarring. Junkets are carefully orchestrated machines where appearances and interviews are locked months in advance, and when one cog is missing, the machinery still usually acknowledges the absence with some kind of excuse. To erase her participation so completely, without even the veneer of explanation, was something different. It was a glaring red flag. Word spread quickly among the press corps, then among executives, and soon throughout the industry at large. If she could not show up for the very promotional events designed to keep her career alive, then what exactly was happening behind the scenes? Within hours, whispers turned to speculation, and speculation hardened into a consensus. Rachel Zegler was no longer in control of her narrative, and the silence that had once been seen as protective had become a symbol of collapse, according to a senior PR insider. The shocking decision to pull Rachel Zegler from the press junket was anything but accidental, and its true origins made the fallout even more damaging. The absence wasn't orchestrated by the studio, which had invested millions into promoting the project and had counted on her presence to anchor the event, but by her own team, who reportedly made the call in a tense, last-minute meeting. What was described by one source as a last-ditch effort wasn't so much a protective measure as it was a desperate attempt to reduce her visibility, to keep her from saying something that could trigger even more headlines. In the short term, it kept her away from the cameras. In the long term, it created a storm of speculation. Industry journalists immediately noticed and began whispering among themselves. Was Zegler being shielded from a deeper scandal, or was something more troubling happening behind the scenes? Instead of projecting strength or discipline, the move made her look vulnerable, unstable, and perhaps even untrustworthy. The studio, blindsided by the decision, was said to be furious. Executives who had expected Zegler to be the face of the campaign suddenly found themselves fielding questions from reporters about why their star wasn't there. The cast, unprepared for her absence, scrambled to fill airtime, stumbling over half-prepared soundbites while the energy in the room shifted from excitement to unease. What should have been a celebration of the ensemble became dominated by questions about who wasn't present, with Zegler's no-show overshadowing every other narrative the studio had tried to build. A strategy once defended as bold and clever, the policy of silence, now looked increasingly like self-sabotage, a plan that had backfired in the most public way possible. The ripple effects spread quickly. A Women in Cinema panel that had previously confirmed her participation quietly dropped her name, afraid of hosting an event that might be overtaken by controversy. A fan Q&A session, once touted as an intimate way to connect with her audience, was abruptly postponed with no new date announced, leaving fans confused and disappointed. Behind the scenes, her publicist was being bombarded with calls from managers, agents, and corporate sponsors, all of whom wanted answers. Why had she disappeared? Why was she backing out of commitments she had made months earlier? And most importantly, who was in charge of managing the fallout? According to insiders, the publicist's phone rang non-stop, with frustrated brand partners demanding to know whether Zegler was still reliable enough to be the face of their campaigns. The erosion of trust wasn't limited to outsiders either. Within her own team, morale fractured. Managers blamed the publicist. The publicist blamed the handlers. Handlers blamed the studio. Everyone acknowledged that the strategy wasn't working, but no one wanted to take responsibility for the growing disaster. It was, as one source put it, a house divided, collapsing in slow motion. What makes the junket fiasco especially telling is that it was supposed to have been the cornerstone of her damage control plan. The idea was simple. By showing up, speaking carefully, and presenting herself as composed and unbothered, she could shift the narrative back in her favor. Instead, her absence signaled the exact opposite: that the team had no strategy left, that the star herself was too fragile or unwilling to appear, and that the crisis had already spun out of control. Veteran industry watchers said this wasn't just a failure, it was a spectacular implosion. The behind-the-scenes atmosphere resembled less a coordinated PR campaign and more a chaotic war room, with factions forming, tempers flaring, and different camps pushing conflicting approaches. Her publicist wasn't just battling negative headlines but was also reportedly clashing with her own management team, who were frustrated with each other and unwilling to compromise. Meetings grew heated, communication broke down, and the team that was supposed to protect her became a source of dysfunction. In the midst of this, Zegler herself seemed increasingly distant, difficult to reach, and less inclined to follow the conventional redemption arc playbook that Hollywood stars usually rely on.
I had a bit of a moment right after we wrapped West Side Story where I wasn't out very often because I was very...
Instead of embracing the time-tested path, apology interviews, carefully written statements, a sympathetic magazine profile, and a controlled re-entry, she resisted, leaving her already fractured team with even fewer options. Those close to her suggest that she was emotionally drained, unwilling to sit for another rehearsed profile or smile through another carefully scripted appearance, and this hesitation only deepened the crisis. What had once seemed like a temporary misstep was now viewed by many as a career unraveling in real time. Sponsors pulled back. Industry allies distanced themselves. Studio executives who had once praised her potential began privately questioning whether she could still anchor major projects. By the time the silence turned into a gaping void filled with rumor and speculation, the issue was no longer about a single event or missed opportunity. It was about whether Rachel Zegler's career machinery had completely broken down. And the answer, at least to those watching from the outside, seemed clearer with each passing day. The publicist, according to those close to the chaos, had grown increasingly alarmed by the stalemate and was pushing harder than ever to shift direction, warning in private that every day Rachel Zegler stayed silent, her reputation slipped further out of her control, and the road back to credibility grew steeper. Their pitch wasn't some grand, headline-grabbing stunt but a precise, carefully measured approach, one that played on vulnerability without surrendering dignity. They suggested something as simple as a personal, heartfelt social media post that acknowledged the storm without feeding it, or a calculated interview with a sympathetic journalist known for drawing out humanity rather than controversy, or even an orchestrated but seemingly casual public appearance alongside a trusted, high-profile ally in the industry. The goal wasn't to dominate the news cycle but to remind audiences that she was still a person, not just a scandal, and to put a face and a voice to the silence that had been haunting the conversation. Nothing ostentatious, one insider summarized, just enough to show she was still human. But her management team reportedly balked at this idea, preferring instead to lean into a philosophy that power could be found in silence, invoking Beyoncé's famously aloof, untouchable image as the model to follow. The problem, of course, was that Rachel Zegler wasn't Beyoncé. She hadn't earned that level of mythic aura, and in her case, the silence read not as commanding but evasive, not as strength but as fragility. The comparison itself became a kind of joke within certain circles, a shorthand for just how out of touch her team had become. Worse still were the internal restrictions that began to choke off even the possibility of consistent messaging. According to those familiar with the dynamic, an almost paranoid system of approvals emerged in which even her official spokesperson, whose job it was to speak, found themselves muzzled. Every statement, no matter how benign, had to pass through layer upon layer of clearance, and more often than not, responses came back watered down, delayed until irrelevant, or rejected entirely. They were silencing their own spokesperson, one exasperated source explained, pointing out the absurdity of trying to run a crisis management plan when the very channels for communication had been sealed shut. The deeper problem was not merely the silence itself but the paralysis it created inside the camp. No one could agree on what the crisis even was, let alone how to solve it. While the publicist kept drafting strategies and mapping out small but meaningful steps forward, other members of the team shot them down before they had a chance to take root, terrified that any move might worsen the situation. Meanwhile, outside the bubble, both fans and the media grew impatient. Audiences who had once been supportive began turning skeptical, filling the vacuum with speculation. Journalists noted her absence at scheduled events and asked pointed questions about projects she was still officially attached to, and the longer the silence stretched on, the more harmful it became. Rumor, conjecture, and half-truths took on the weight of fact, and the narrative slipped further out of her grasp with each passing week. Behind the curtain, the publicist was said to be working tirelessly, lining up potential interviews, drafting statements, and even quietly securing tentative slots at low-profile gatherings where Zegler might test the waters again. But time after time, these opportunities were reportedly blocked, delayed, or outright cancelled by other team members who clung stubbornly to the silence doctrine. And in Hollywood, dysfunction never stays private for long. Studio executives began noticing the cracks. Calls went unanswered, emails contradicted one another, promises were broken. Other PR firms caught wind of the chaos and, true to the industry's predatory instincts, began whispering about the internal fractures, turning Zegler's crisis into gossip fodder for cocktail parties and industry lunches. By then, the question wasn't whether she was mishandling the scandal but whether she could be trusted at all. According to one insider, the publicist's workload became a treadmill with no off switch, hours spent crafting plans that never saw daylight, watching helplessly as opportunities evaporated while rivals snickered. The exhaustion was palpable, the embarrassment even sharper, and the sense of futility overwhelming. So when the publicist finally walked away, it wasn't with the usual ritual of polite farewells and face-saving statements. There was no attempt to spin the exit as amicable or temporary, no carefully worded declaration of continuing support. Instead, the break was clean, cold, and complete. To those on the outside, the silence of the departure spoke louder than any official line could have. It was not merely the story of a difficult client. It was, as one source said bluntly, the story of someone turning into a liability and a strategy that had become not just ineffective but laughable within the circles that mattered most. The publicist's exit confirmed what many in the industry had already suspected. The team wasn't just divided, it was imploding, and Rachel Zegler was now caught in the middle of a PR collapse so spectacular that it had shifted from a behind-the-scenes struggle into a cautionary tale whispered across Hollywood. According to multiple well-placed reports, the final breaking point came when one of the major studios, an industry powerhouse that had been working quietly but consistently with Rachel Zegler's camp on the scheduling of future press conferences, publicity events, and promotional rollouts, drew a hard line and refused to proceed any further until her reputation was repaired. This kind of demand is not common. In fact, such language is usually reserved for stars who have found themselves engulfed in scandals of the most serious nature, legal battles, criminal charges, or behavior so publicly reckless that their very presence risks contaminating a brand. Yet here it was being applied to Zegler, whose controversies, at least on paper, were far smaller in scope, rooted more in Broadway feuds, online backlash, and whispers of difficult behavior than in anything legally damning. That disconnect made the moment all the more sobering. And yet, despite the seriousness of the ultimatum, the internal response was, by all accounts, non-existent. There was no emergency recalibration, no sudden unveiling of a new narrative strategy, no carefully orchestrated apology tour, just more of the same silence that had already been choking her career momentum for weeks. The most striking part of this inertia is that the warning had been delivered directly by her publicist, someone who was hardly green or naive but rather a veteran of the industry, a professional who had weathered storms far more damaging and guided names far bigger than Zegler through scandals that would have buried a less resilient star. This was not an amateur misreading the room but an expert laying out the steps required for survival, only to find those steps dismissed or ignored by a team more invested in infighting than in solutions. It was like playing chess with people fighting over the color of the board, one insider explained, their frustration evident, suggesting that even the most basic groundwork for recovery had been sabotaged by endless disagreements about optics rather than substance. The consequences of this paralysis left Zegler exposed in a way that very few stars of her generation ever experience. For the first time since her career had taken off, she was navigating the public eye without any kind of protective barrier. Gone was the publicist who could craft and polish a message, who could pick up the phone and persuade a journalist to soften their coverage, who could arrange a sympathetic interview or a well-placed photo op to humanize her when the press grew hostile. Gone, too, were the carefully managed leaks to tabloids, the stage-managed charity appearances designed to shift the narrative, the little lifelines that stars typically deploy when the tide turns against them. In their place was a suffocating silence, leaving the full weight of controversy pressing squarely on her shoulders without mediation or defense. In Hollywood, where perception is as valuable as talent, this kind of exposure can be lethal. Celebrities who stumble in the public eye generally rush to regain control within hours, if not minutes. They issue contrite statements on Instagram, arrange candid-feeling interviews with trusted outlets, or stage surprise public appearances to remind fans of their relatability. Yet Zegler did none of this. The days slipped by, then the weeks, with no acknowledgement of the storm brewing around her, no reference to her publicist's reported departure, not even the kind of vague, self-aware post that might have bought her a little goodwill. Her absence was no longer strategic. It was conspicuous, a silence that had begun to curdle into something more dangerous. What made the situation so extraordinary was the way her stillness began to feed the very rumors it was meant to contain. In the absence of clarity, speculation became the dominant narrative. Was she being hidden by her team because something worse was about to come out? Was she refusing to listen to the people hired to protect her? Was she unraveling privately in a way that no one wanted to admit publicly? Each theory gained traction, filling the void her silence left behind. Industry veterans, used to seeing stars bend over backwards to manage their reputations, began to interpret her disappearance not as mystery but as fragility. The same executives who had once praised her talent and charisma now spoke in hushed tones about her unreliability. Other studios, watching closely, began quietly backing away from projects that had once seemed secure. Sponsorship opportunities evaporated. Journalists, deprived of answers, began to turn sharper, their questions more cutting, their headlines less forgiving. In this business, where careers can be undone not by the truth but by the perception of instability, the silence itself became the scandal. And for a rising actress once hailed as one of Hollywood's brightest new voices, the tragedy of the moment was that the original controversy now seemed almost irrelevant compared to the spectacle of her inability, or refusal, to respond. There are increasingly urgent questions being raised by Rachel Zegler's prolonged silence, and they extend well beyond the surface-level debate about whether this is an image strategy gone wrong or simply a moment of personal retreat. At the core, industry observers are wondering if she even fully comprehends the scale of the situation she now finds herself in. According to one executive at a production firm still tied to her projects, the optics are alarming. Without a team filtering her words or guiding her through carefully controlled interactions, Zegler risks facing the industry completely exposed, without armor. In Hollywood, exposure is not freedom, it is danger. Every syllable she utters, every micro-expression in an interview, every caption on a social media post will be dissected, framed, and judged. And the longer she waits, the harsher that judgment becomes. Silence in this business does not buy peace. It invites speculation, and speculation rarely benefits the person at the center of it. This is the toxic nature of prolonged quiet in an industry addicted to stories. When you fail to engage, you don't just surrender control of your narrative, you become the narrative itself. The absence of commentary becomes the story, a vacuum that audiences, tabloids, bloggers, and rival insiders eagerly rush to fill. Fan theories spiral into elaborate threads, memes transform half-truths into cultural shorthand, and even respected critics begin repeating speculation as though it were fact. In that void, industry gatekeepers, casting directors, studio executives, producers with billions of dollars on the line, start asking themselves hard questions. If Rachel Zegler won't show up, who will? If her voice is missing, whose voice can replace it? Momentum is the lifeblood of stardom, and momentum never pauses, it simply shifts. In Hollywood, opportunities don't sit on hold until you're ready. If you don't claim them, someone else does. The departure of her publicist, an exit that stripped her of the one buffer she had left, has only accelerated the unraveling. The professional safety net is gone. Where there was once a trained advocate ready to craft her message, deflect scandals, and redirect attention toward upcoming projects, there is now nothing but silence and uncertainty. Hollywood is an industry obsessed with image, and when the people who make their living managing crises start to back away, it sends an unmistakable signal: this client is too volatile to touch. Reports suggest that multiple PR agencies have already declined to meet with her team, with one veteran publicist captured in an off-the-record remark saying, "It's radioactive right now, there's no upside, just fallout." That kind of language doesn't just reflect hesitation, it borders on exile. The ripple effects of that reputational freefall are everywhere. Directors who once praised her publicly have gone eerily quiet, avoiding her name in interviews and press events. Projects that once seemed eager to tout her involvement are quietly erasing her from the conversation. Insiders whisper that her name has been removed from shortlists for major roles, not through any official announcement but through the quieter, deadlier process of simply being excluded. Streaming platforms that once marketed her as the face of a new generation of diverse talent are now pushing her promotional campaigns into TBD status, an industry code word that often means never. This is how Hollywood shuts its doors, not with grand statements, not with official cancellations, but with subtle, unspoken refusals. You don't get openly fired, you get ghosted. Even those who once worked alongside her seem confused about how to proceed. Some former co-stars still like her old posts, an act that could be read as support, while simultaneously avoiding tagging her or mentioning her in current press tours. It is a balancing act. Acknowledge the history without inviting the controversy. For fans, the divide is even sharper. Loyal supporters flood social media with passionate defenses, accusing the industry of hypocrisy and double standards. One viral tweet read, "You all love mysterious when it's a man, but when Rachel goes quiet, you call it arrogance." The sentiment resonated with thousands, pointing out how Hollywood often frames male silence as genius and female silence as weakness. Yet detractors are equally vocal, arguing that a refusal to communicate, to acknowledge fans or address concerns, comes across not as enigmatic but as entitled and dismissive. The end result is that social media, which could have been a platform for rebuilding her brand, has become a battlefield where every day of her silence gives fuel to both sides. Defenders frame her as a victim of systemic bias, while critics frame her as her own worst enemy. The frightening reality is that both narratives may eventually collapse into one conclusion: that Rachel Zegler, once poised as a face of Hollywood's next generation, has allowed her story to be written by everyone but herself. And in Hollywood, once you lose control of your narrative, it is nearly impossible to take it back. Critics have been especially unforgiving, turning Rachel Zegler's past work and words into a kind of endless replay reel where every gesture is scrutinized and reinterpreted. What might once have been viewed as a slightly awkward moment in an interview, a nervous laugh, or a poorly chosen phrase is now framed as evidence of arrogance, entitlement, or a refusal to take responsibility. TikTok, with its culture of remix and satire, has become the epicenter of this rebranding campaign. Creators are splicing together clips of her interviews with captions that highlight supposed contradictions or shortcomings, transforming ordinary comments into gotcha moments. An interview where she once described her work ethic is now edited next to a mocking commentary track. A light-hearted joke told years ago is reframed as a red flag. The speed and creativity of the platform make it nearly impossible to counter. Once a narrative catches on there, it spreads through hashtags, duets, and stitches like wildfire. What makes this shift even more damaging is the response from audiences who previously held no strong opinion of her. These weren't critics or superfans, just casual observers, and their reactions are perhaps the most telling. A large segment